what I'd planned to do, this might be a remarkably reckless thing to do on my part, but I'm out of town, and I was going to give you a paper on the social control or the control theory interpretation of psychological research on aggression. Aggression is a concept to explain crime and related behaviors that threatens our theory. It's a competitive explanation to our theory, which relies on self-control. And so what this paper does, I can tell you, and actually if I don't present it, I can tell you with a great deal of confidence that it blows away the idea of aggression, and it substitutes in itself the idea of self-control as being the more general concept, finds fault with the psychological research, the laboratory research on aggression, and the field studies research on aggression as being lacking convergent and discriminant validity. That's about a 40-page paper, and that's all there is to it. I would go through it with some more detail, but in having conversations with most of you this morning, at breakfast and during the session we had this morning, and then at lunch, it occurred to me that what may be a good deal more interesting to you would be to hear me talk about what may be the public policy implications of a general theory of crime. I am as we were talking on the way over, I am a criminal justician. That's the way I define myself. I got my degree in criminal justice at SUNY Albany. It's a small school up the road that doesn't rival this program. We've always had, you'll see as you get to be alumni from this program, that there's something of a tension out in the world between the Sam Houston model and but I'm a criminal justician, and I am interested in public policy questions. I'm also, I think, to be fundamentally interested in public policy questions, one ought to also be interested in basic ideological questions. That is to say, I think it's very difficult to answer questions about what we ought to do about crime from a public policy point of view without figuring out what crime is on the one hand and what causes it on the other hand. I'm not naive enough to believe that all causal theories have direct public policy implications or even have tolerable public policy implications. There's something of a rough relationship between what may be true in the scientific world and what may be desirable or tolerable in terms of the public policy world. But I do believe there is a fundamental relationship. And part of the reason for us getting interested in writing a general theory of crime derived from public policy questions. We wrote a series of papers, in part, about proposals about public policy and research design to affect public policy, in which we were very critical of contemporary deterrence models, incapacitation models, and rehabilitative efforts. We were critical of those efforts on the basis of some principles that were largely implicit about the causes of crime and the nature of crime. So we wrote this ideological book that is mostly, I think, considered in universities and the literature this day as a causal theory of crime. Well, we wrote it in part to wonder about public policy. And I think that whereas aggression maybe and kind of the relationship between the laboratory studies in psychology and the social control theory may be of some interest, that probably it's fair enough to say that the public policy questions would be more exciting to talk about and more stimulating. So I am throwing caution to the wind, and I am going to try to address in as systematic way as I can public policy questions deriving from a general theory of crime. The way that I would like to do it is to sketch a little bit, and this will be somewhat redundant for some of you who are with us this morning, just sketch a few of the details of what our theory is about, because again, I'm not naive enough to believe that everyone has memorized the first 5 chapters of a general theory of crime. So I'll review those for those of you whose memory is a little shaky, who may have not encountered the book yet, develop the theory a little bit, and then go directly to the public policy questions. One of the ways of approaching public policy questions about crime, it seems to me, is to do it from the point of view of the taxpayer. After all, the criminal justice system is a publicly funded set of organizations, and taxpayers supply increasing amounts of resources to the criminal justice system, and it's reasonable for them to expect some return on those investments. I have to apologize a little bit for my language. I also work in a business school, so I have to dodge economic language wherever I am and around my own university. But that's, I think, a fair enough caricature of what of one way to approach public policy questions is we're spending some money, taxpayers' money. What are we telling the taxpayers we're doing, and what should we, what kind of promises should we generate to the taxpayers about their money? Well, it's clear at one level that one of the things we're doing in Texas, as elsewhere, is we're spending a good deal more of the taxpayers' money with respect to the criminal justice system. By almost whatever measure, and since I wasn't prepared to give this part of the talk, I'm not prepared to document this, but let's take it at face value. Expenditures, I know this is true for Arizona, I assume it's true for Texas. Expenditures, per capita expenditures in the criminal justice system have skyrocketed in recent decades. We are investing much more in the criminal justice system than we have in the past by a variety of measures. And surely if you track incarceration rates as one indicant of the activity in criminal justice, the trends there are prominent, convincing that we have turned our attention to criminal justice, especially since 1980, in terms of expenditures in a way that we hadn't in the past. In terms of proportionate expenditures of state budget, certainly in Arizona, the criminal justice system has an increasing share of these expenditures. All the while, of course, one of the taxpayers' measures of value, return on their investment, certainly is the crime rate, and the crime rate, certainly by the Uniform Crime Report measures, has not declined commensurate with those increased expenditures. And as a matter of fact, since I do have the source book here, but I won't turn to it, I think probably since about 1985, when there was a small downturn in the crime rate between 80 and 85, the crime rate has marched relentlessly higher. So just like in other realms of governmental expenditures like education, transportation, where taxpayers turn to the education establishment and say, gee, we seem to be investing more, but SAT scores are declining. We seem to be spending more on education, but we don't seem to be getting anything more for our dollar. Why isn't it fair? And I think it is equally fair, at least, to ask the question about the criminal justice system. Why aren't we getting the return on our money that we seem to be promising the taxpayers? Well, this theory's got the answers to that. The short answer to that is because we are spending our money in the wrong place. We are addressing the wrong image of crime, and we are addressing crime in the wrong point in the life cycle. This theory sees current public policy about criminal justice would be described by this theory as following several fallacies about crime in terms of its response to criminal justice. Let me identify what those fallacies are and write them down so I don't forget at the same time. The first fallacy we might call the adult fallacy. The second fallacy we might call the specialist fallacy. The third fallacy we might call the histrionic fallacy. And the fourth fallacy we might call the institutional fallacy. Arguably, our public policy about crime in this country is largely determined by these four fallacies. Let's talk about what they are. Histrionic fallacy. The picture of crime as depicted in the mass media is, and by politicians on the floor of the legislature, who are informed largely about crime in the same way that the rest of us are informed about crime, and that is by consuming the media, whether it's television or motion pictures or the newspaper. The picture of crime, the image of crime depicted in the mass media is as far from reality of crime as it could possibly be. Public policy about crime in the United States follows the image of crime that is in the media, it's on the floor of the legislature, and which is, as a consequence, divorced from ordinary crime. Ordinary crime is not well characterized by the serial murderer, and we talked about some of this morning. It's not well characterized by large stock swindles. It's not well characterized by highly organized, drug-running gangs that are pursuing enormous profits and enforcing territorial claims by the use of assault rifles. The vast majority of crime is relatively ordinary, straightforward, remarkably trivial and opportunistic behavior. It tends not to be serious by most measures or connotations of that term. It particularly tends not to be serious from the point of view, as we talked about this morning, from the point of view of the offender. It does tend to be serious oftentimes in terms of the point of view of the victim, a topic that we can return to. But ordinary crime tends to be opportunistic. The data about criminology support that portrait overwhelmingly. And again, at the expense of repeating myself from this morning a little bit, we'll say that the typical burglar is not a cat burglar who plans, is not a career criminal who plans events long in advance and targets expensive residences and specific expensive goods within the residence. The typical burglary is attempted in the first part. That's an important fact. Is not completed. That characterizes most crime, by the way. It does not even satisfy what the offender wanted it to. It went wrong. It didn't work. It's attempted. Right? But it tends to be the typical burglar. If you read police reports or study burglary offenses, as a juvenile who wanders through a apartment complex and trying doors, finds one that's open, walks in and steals whatever is opportunistically available, easily portable, and looks of interest and value to him. The typical, and may not even steal things within the premise that are the most valuable, for that matter, but things that are easily portable, that look useful to him, alcohol, electronic equipments, money on the top of dressers, and so forth. The typical motor vehicle theft it can be described very similarly. It is one or more adolescent males wandering down the street or through a parking lot or through a mall, a shopping center mall, virtually without any intentions of theft whatsoever. They see a car with the keys in it, and they drive it, take it, steal it, drive it until it runs out of gas, or they crash into something. It's an opportunistic crime where it could be described that the offender received very little gain, but it was some pleasurable activity of the moment, and undertook the activity without regard for long-term consequences. Our theory argues that if you start with crime rather than the criminal, and you describe what crime is like, you really get down and you forget the histrionic portrait of the media, if you forget the sensational fallacy, or whatever fallacy, however you want to depict it, and you get down and look what crime is like, it is largely spontaneous, largely opportunistic, trivial behavior. And this theory says it can be accurately described as all crimes can be accurately described as acts of force, fraud, or mood enhancement in pursuit of pleasures of the moment without attention to long-term consequences. And all crime can be described that way. And we think that if you systematically look at the various forms of crime, like homicide or assault or forcible rape or robbery, they all pretty much fit that depiction of the act. Not the depiction of planned, highly organized, highly motivated activity that requires explanations of driving forces and motives and the like. So, and I think it's arguable that our public policy would be better served if it followed the accurate portrait of what crime is like, rather than the the misleading portrait of what crime is like. So instead of worrying a lot about sentencing policy for serial killers or homicide people, or long terms of imprisonment for burglary offenders or the like, now our theory would say, you'd actually get more for your money if you worried about the conditions under which specific burglaries are likely to take place. That is to say, this theory would be a crime prevention type of theory that would say, gee, why don't you focus on the small impediments to everyday crime, locking doors, using steering column locks, lighting places, and so forth, that will reduce the spontaneous opportunistic behavior of people who are so inclined. And as a matter of fact, the literature, particularly the literature in Europe, less so than in the United States, the literature that the Home Office has done in London and the Justice Department in the Netherlands, where they have seriously operationalized crime prevention programs like that, done experiments, tried to test out their validity, are consistent with that point of view. You can actually reduce some crime by reducing opportunities of the moment if you focus your public policy on what crime is like rather than what is a good story. And newspapers are not to be faulted, or media are not to be faulted by telling us what are the sensational things that captivate our attention, because that's what sells newspapers and that's what we like to read. It's our mistake when we take that depiction of what crime is like, believe that that is what most crime is like, and design public policy on the basis of it. So if crime is defined as simple acts of pursuit of self-interest in the moment, use of force, fraud, mood enhancement, without regard to long-term consequences, we will have captured the bulk of criminal activity. Well, we can argue that there is that the criminal justice system operates on what we could refer to, I guess, as an adult fallacy, too, in our public policy, particularly in our sentencing practices, in our incarceration policies. The criminal justice system operates as though the principal offenders in crime and delinquency are adult, rational, calculating actors, and we take consequences on the basis of that image of crime. The overwhelming evidence about crime is that it is the activity of children and adolescents. The adult fallacy, stated as not a fallacy, but stated as a principle, is the relationship between age and crime. And the relationship between age and crime has been known now for 100 years, and it is quite unlike what we typically think about when we're thinking about public policy about crime. All crime, whatever form of crime, peaks radically in late adolescence or early adulthood. It comes out of nowhere. Rates of criminal activity from about age 10 radically peaks, sharply peaks at 17 or 18 for property crime, a little later for adult crime, and then radically starts to decline from that peak. The moment it peaks, it starts to decline very dramatically, and it declines continuously throughout life. Travis Hershey and I have referred to that as the age invariance thesis. We investigated the relationship between age and crime in a variety of countries with a variety of different kinds of data for the variety of crimes that are available, different cultures, different demographic groups, and so forth, and came to the conclusion that that distribution of crime characterizes everybody. It does not differ for boys or girls, blacks or whites, Americans or Japanese, 1875 England, 1990 Houston. The age distribution of crime, the functional form of that relationship is the same anywhere and everywhere you look. Just prowling through here because I have a overhead of that, but I seem to have lost it, that distribution. Well, in any event, a rapid onset, a peak, and a continuous decline over the life cycle. The consequence of that is, and similar to talking about the histrionic fallacy, the adult fallacy, the consequence of that is crime policy should be policy about children, not adults. All effective crime policy has to be policy about children, because that's where the action is. Now, you can think of 17 and 18-year-olds in terms of adults or children or so forth, but when you see the age distribution of crime rapidly skyrocketing from age 10, sharp peak, and a continuous decline, it's clear that whatever you're doing to offenders late in life, whether you're doing to them or for them or with them, is unlikely to have a major effect on crime rates. Remember, I'm arguing that this age distribution of crime is invariant. It's the same for everyone. It's the same for highly active offenders and for less active offenders. They all are most active in their teenage years, and they all decline very rapidly subsequent to their teenage years. What that implies is that whatever we do about crime, in order to have a major effect on it, we have to affect the teenage years, or whatever it is that causes people to be highly active during their teenage years. Yet arguably most of the activity, most of the arguments about public policy, certainly most of the investment in the criminal justice system is in the criminal justice system. It's in the adult system. It's in adult system of incarceration and the like. So if you're talking to the taxpayer and you explain to them the age effect, they are likely to ask of you, how come you're spending all your money on old people if you know that the problem is a problem of young people? And I think that's a reasonable question for the taxpayer to ask. One thing that we know, let's wander through these fallacies. That's the adult fallacy. I think another fallacy that we have with respect to public policy that is inconsistent with this theory is the specialist fallacy. Now, the specialist fallacy comes in a lot of different cloths in the criminal justice system. It has over time. Today, it tends to be referred to as the career criminal problem, that there are a set of offenders whose offenses have escalated over time in seriousness, who tend to specialize in certain activities, tend to specialize in particularly serious activities, and that those are the offenders about whom the criminal justice system should mobilize, target, and do something with, to, for, or about. The empirical literature on criminology falsifies the specialist hypothesis, the career hypothesis, and has since 1940. The empirical criminologists have looked for evidence of specialization and have found very little evidence of it. A little bit here, you apply a certain kind of Markov probability chain there, and it's statistically significant in the transition between the fourth and the fifth offense for those who pursue 5 offenses and the like. But if you step back from the literature and you ask the basic question, what are offenders like? Do they specialize in forms of crime? The answer has consistently been no, they do not. Beyond trivial, opportunistic specialization, our guy who was doing the burglary in his apartment complex, if he does one day and he walks down the corridor and does another one the next day, and if he were caught for those 2 events, would be a burglar. But, as we described this morning, if the door was locked and he walked down the stairs and he saw the car sitting in the street, particularly a red Camaro sitting on the street with the keys in the ignition, he might think that would be an interesting thing to get in there and drive away with it. And he would be an auto thief. And there is no tendency anywhere in the literature. Now, this is a bald statement, but I'm prepared to defend it, just like the adult fallacy. There is no compelling evidence in the literature to believe in specialization. The compelling evidence is exactly the other way around. Offenders are incredibly versatile. People who have high rates of criminal activity have high rates of all forms of criminal activity. People who have high rates of theft have high rates of drug use, alcohol use. The versatility effect which is the opposite of this specialist fallacy. The versatility effect goes well beyond ordinary crimes and delinquencies. It includes such things as accidents. As a matter of fact, there is a heavy and persistent correlation in the literature between people who have high accident rates driving cars and people with criminal court convictions. There's a good correlation there. People who have high accident rates are much more likely than others to have high rates of involvement in criminal activity, and vice versa. Doesn't pertain just to automobile accidents. Some work we did in Great Britain demonstrated quite convincingly, at least to my mind, piece is unpublished, I couldn't get it refereed, but it demonstrated quite convincingly that people who set their houses on fire have much higher rates of criminal activity. The versatility effect is extremely broad, both within criminal activity and within criminal activity and analogous kinds of behavior. Drug use, alcohol use, criminal activity go together. You tend not to have specialists in drug use, high levels of drug use, who also don't have histories of theft and the like. Goes further, it involves the school. So misconduct problems in school at a very early age are heavily correlated with criminal activity. That's not news. The Glucks pointed that out in 1940. Subsequent research has done nothing but validate that early misconduct in school effect and criminal involvement. So the versatility effect manifests itself in school problems. Truancy, tardiness, misperformance or malperformance within school, assaultive behavior, pushing, shoving, not getting along, talking back to the teacher, and poor school performance are similarly related to criminal activity. So we tend to set policy, I would argue, on the basis of such things as we have burglary statutes, and we're worried about when there's a wave of homicide statutes and the like. So we tend to be offense specific. We have burglary units in police departments. We have auto theft units in police departments. It permeates public policy about criminal justice, however you cut it. General theory of crime says that's wrong. People don't specialize. If the auto theft unit and the burglary unit would get together, they'd find out they're chasing the same guy. And oftentimes they do, and it is the same guy. So because people don't specialize in burglary, and we ought to change our public policy in such a way and stop suggesting that we do. The versatility effect plays itself out differentially through the life course, however, because as people age, they tend to get involved in different forms of activity as a consequence of age. So if you look at very young children, the versatility effect, or the absence of specialization, would be found, say, among first graders in the extent to which they tend to push and shove, assault, take things from other children without their permission, theft, talking back to teachers, and truancy, not going to school at all. As those same folks age and get into the labor force years, the versatility effect changes. 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds aren't involved in truancy, but they would tend to be involved in employment instability patterns. So having difficulty getting a job, having difficulty keeping a job once they get it, showing up to work late, is the analog in the adult setting of the juvenile school misconduct. And our folks who are committing burglary, involved in drug use, high alcohol use and so forth, are having difficulties in the workplace too. And that's not particularly controversial, but in fact it's very well known. But the curious thing is, I think that our public policies don't attend to that very substantially. The fourth fallacy that I've written down here I call the institutional fallacy. This one is probably more difficult to characterize. Maybe I should have used a different word. And more difficult to swallow, probably, too, at the same time. And this causes our theory a lot of trouble. Americans have an abiding, let's put it this way, Americans have an abiding faith in the influence of their institutions. We just tend to put a lot of stock in the ability of our social and governmental institutions to fix things that have gone wrong, or fix things and make them better. So in the educational realm, we look to our schools to solve our educational problems. Seems like a logical connection. SAT scores are declining. The Japanese are way ahead of us in productivity. What's going wrong? Well, let's get the schools to fix it. So we invest in schools. We create school policies, and we continuously create school policies. And right now we're creating voucher policies and privatization policies for school to fix that problem. The institution is going to make it better. Well, in this realm, in criminal activity realm, our abiding faith is in the criminal justice system. And that's where our public policy focus ought to be for the crime problem. The crime rate is going up, as it has pretty relentlessly in the last decade. A little blip. Actually, step back, look at that graph from the 1960s on. It has gone up. What's going on? Well, there must be something wrong with our institutions. So we start trying to fix our institutions to fix the crime problem. And I guess I would characterize this the institutional fallacy. Let me put it as bluntly as possible. This theory says the criminal justice system is largely irrelevant to the crime problem. Largely irrelevant. It also incidentally says that the school system is largely irrelevant to the education problem. This theory says the crime problem is a problem of parenting. It's a problem that comes way before the criminal justice system ever gets involved or ever could get involved. Here's the positive way of asserting that from the empirical literature. It's what we call the stability hypothesis, the stability effect. Individual differences in committing crime and analogous behaviors are reasonably stable from the point at which they're first identified, 8 years old, throughout life. That's the stability effect. That's an amazing thing to say. How could he possibly back this up? Well, let me repeat it in a slightly different way to indicate what I'm saying. Individual differences in criminal activity are reasonably stable from the time they're first identified over the life course. That wasn't the other way that I was going to say it. Let me say it a slightly different way. If you rank order people when they're 8 years old, using a wide variety of methods to rank order people. And a common procedure is to have teachers and peers rank order people in terms of their troublesomeness in the classroom. Teachers can do that, and they can actually do that very reliably. And peers do that, and peers do that reasonably reliably. But regardless of the reliability of the measurement, and there are some difficulties there, what's impressive is that those rank orderings maintain themselves over a vast period of life, 30 years later. One good aggression study used those kinds of measures to predict criminal court convictions 30 years later. There's a prominent review of the aggression literature, which I just, for the sake of argument, assume is the crime literature, because I think it is. A prominent review of the aggression literature reviewed 60 of the best studies. These are longitudinal studies where people try to assess the predictability or the continuity over the life course, is the language, of misconduct problems early on, and how well those, or how people separate themselves early on, and how that tracks over the life course. About 60 studies find the stability in aggression to be essentially of the same magnitude as the stability IQ test scores, which is the most stable individual characteristic psychologists have measured. Right? It's very high. Not high enough for some purposes, as we talked about this morning, but too high to ignore. There is an enormous continuity over the life course in the terms of people getting into difficulty, either with the law or drugs or school or the workplace. Now, whatever you think about that continuity, the fact of that predictability, of that magnitude of predictability, suggests that if you don't fix it from the get-go, you're going to have a lot of difficulty fixing it later. In other words, it suggests that you should worry about making those differences as small as possible at age 8 because you are unlikely to be able to do much about it subsequently. That's what the empirical literature suggests. This suggests it to me. We do exactly the opposite in our crime policy. Our crime policy is not family policy. It is not prevention policy. It is institutional policy, the institution being the criminal justice system. Our crime policies, in terms of where the bucks go, tend to be things like incapacitation or selective incapacitation in the adult system. Our crime policies tend to be wondering about whether 2 police in the car would reduce crime over having 1 police officer in the car. Our crime policies tend to be, I wonder whether we ought to waive people who are 17 into the adult court, or would it be better to treat them as juveniles? Right? Our crime policies are all subsequent to the action. And to the extent that this stability effect is true, very unlikely to have any effect. So we think that's reasonably consistent with what the empirical literature says about efforts in the criminal justice system and about rehabilitation in particular. Another example. Our image of crime says that it is relatively spontaneous activity committed by people who are overwhelmed by their self-interest of the moment and who don't attend to long-term consequences. Right? Because if they attended to long-term consequences, they wouldn't do it. The balance is always negative, and so it's curious why some people would do it. Well, it's because they don't pay attention to the long-term consequences. That's what crime looks like when you look at it. Yet, what we tend to do in public policy about crime is tinker with the long-term consequences. So we have endless debates about whether the median time served for robbery offenders ought to be 7.5 years or 12. And people argue justice, and they'll argue incapacitation, and they'll argue deterrence. Well, it doesn't matter one whit whether it's 5 or 12 or 15 or 25. If you're not paying attention to long-term consequences, you are not paying attention to long-term consequences. It will not deter you. Now, deterrence literature is complicated. There's a lot of it. But I argue that this characterization is very consistent with the overwhelming body of empirical work about general deterrence. General deterrence in crime policy is sort of like social class in sociological theory. There are hundreds of studies trying to find out whether there's an effect at all. And people disagree. They say, no, there's no effect. So it says, yes, there is. There's a marginal deterrence. I mean, actually, with a properly specified logistic model, when your data set is accurately and you're paying attention to felony harm, you can actually, at the third order, there is an effect. And the guy comes back and says, no, actually, you had a misspecified model. Well, if deterrence works, why isn't there patent, obvious? Why are the researchers worrying so much about whether to even document an effect? And I would just cite the National Academy of Sciences review in 1978 by Al Bloomstein, clearly an expert in the area, no friend of this theory, who says, well, you know, on balance, actually, you know, you can't reject the hypothesis that there might be a deterrence effect. That's what the National Academy of Sciences says. On balance, you really can't reject the idea that there might be an effect. And that sort of drives most of the public policy that we have on the floor of the legislature in terms of, well, I say on balance isn't good enough. Overwhelmingly, it's not a big deal. What you do know is a big deal and does drive a lot of crime happens in the first 8 years of life. People either do or do not learn to subordinate their self-interest to the interests of other people. People have to be taught to do that. They typically are taught to do that by their parents or other caretakers, people who care about them. And that's something that once learned stays with you for the rest of your life. It's a remarkable thing. Don't know why. Most social scientific theories would suggest that it shouldn't. It ought to be more ephemeral. You need external reinforcement. This is one thing that doesn't. You learn it early in life. It's a continuum, so I'm sort of characterizing it. You learn it early in life to subordinate your interest to the interests of other people. That's what we call self-control. The motivations for crime are obvious. They're given in the act. The objects of crime are universally desired things. Money, sex, mood enhancement. They're things that the human condition desires. We don't need theories of crime to tell us where the motivation for crime comes from. It's plentiful. It's all around us. It's obvious. What we need theories of crime to do is tell us how come we do not take advantage of this self-interest more than we do. And most of us don't take advantage of it very much. And this theory says it's because we were socialized very early in life not to... Oh, my time's up. I'm almost out of things to say. I was out of things to say 40 minutes ago. Our theory says that you are socialized very early in life to delay your own gratification, subordinate your own self-interest to the interests of other people. How does that happen? Well, very, very quickly, as we discussed briefly this morning, it typically happens by parents or a parent surrogate. The only requirement being that the child has a caretaker that cares about the long-term interests of the child. If there's someone who cares about the long-term interests of the child, they will necessarily care to teach the child to subordinate self-interest to the interests of others. Not everybody, unfortunately, but true, not everybody is born into the world with a caretaker who cares about their long term. Most people are, fortunately. Secondly, that caretaker has to monitor the behavior of the child. Well, this model says that caring is not enough. You can't care and leave. You can't say you care and leave. Somebody has to be around to monitor the behavior of the child in order to be there to correct unbridled pursuit of self-interest when it interferes with the rights of others. You've got to have a caretaker who cares. You've got to have a caretaker who's around. The third thing you have to have is a caretaker who knows the difference between deviance and conformity. And that's not always true. You have to have a caretaker who recognizes when things are going wrong. So have to know that, the example we used this morning, you have to know that when your 6-year-old is not going to school, that's wrong. 6-year-old's got to go to school. Somebody's got to decide, recognize that that's a trouble sign, that staying home to watch television is not a good idea. It's not in the interest of the child. It's not in the long-term interest of the child. And that behavior is deviant and has to be sanctioned. The caretaker has to know that smoking cigarettes when you're 13 years old is not a good idea. Most people don't. It's deviant. It's a sign of trouble. You have to sanction that behavior. Truancy, as we said earlier today, habitual truancy starts in the first grade and correlates very substantially with truancy throughout junior and senior high school. Well, if people are truant in the first grade, it's hard to argue, at least on the basis of this theory, that that's the child's fault. Because this theory says most children would prefer to be truant. It's more fun. It's better not to go to school than to go to school. It's better to sleep in than to get up early in the morning. It's more fun to watch television and play Nintendo than it is to go to hear Mrs. Baker talk about insects. So truancy is not problematic. Truancy is expected. The absence of truancy is problematic, and that's what has to be taught by a caretaker who cares who's there to monitor, who recognizes his deviant behavior. And the fourth thing that gets us into trouble all over the world is to say that the deviant behavior has to be sanctioned. It has to be punished. It has to be extinguished. We have been accused of all sorts of barbarous things on the basis of this simple assertion. Let me say publicly while the machine is on, I do not beat my children. I never have. And I don't think that that's the kind of punishment that's required. And my children are extremely well behaving. And I hope they're able to see this and realize that their dad talks about them this way. But negative self-interested behavior has to have a sanction associated with it for it to not exist. That sanction has to be negative. It is a sanctioning theory to extinguish the naturally occurring behavior, which is crime and deviance. If that's where all the action is, people develop or don't develop on a kind of a continuum, self-control early in life, then that's where we ought to put the taxpayers' money. If it's created early in life, hypothesis 1, it's relatively stable over the life course, hypothesis 2. Crime is over for all meaningful purposes after the teenage years, 3. Institutional fallacy says, as a consequence of those, most of the things we do in crime policy are irrelevant to crime. Then I think what we ought to tell the taxpayers is, now you don't need selective incapacitation. Don't worry about how long the terms are on a crime prevention point of view. Have enough police that you're comfortable with, but they're a drop in the bucket. Double the size of the police force. You got 2 drops in the bucket. That's not going to reduce crime. Parents reduce crime. The absence of parenting causes crime. If you want to put the taxpayers' money in the right basket, put it into parenting. I'll stop there. Just made the whole thing up and entertain questions.
Take a break for a second?
Huh?
Take a drink of water for a second?
Sure.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to introduce Professor Rolando Del Carmen to sort of moderate the discussion, if I could. And I want to recognize him because Professor Del Carmen is the architect, in large measure, along with his standing committee on doctoral studies from last year of the Beto Chair series this year, and has always been one of the principal driving forces behind the Beto Chair series. So, Professor Del Carmen, I'll turn it over to you to invite questions. I'd be very, very surprised if there aren't many.
Did I mention that I have a 2 o'clock?
No, you don't. No, you don't.
Yeah, I think I must say that I guess you've noticed that all of our 3 speakers this semester have some connections, one way or the other, with SUNY Albany. And I would say that is purely accidental. Despite the fact that the dean was coming.
That's right. We came even though you hired him. At least, well, I don't speak for the others. They're not here yet.
Okay, I think we have about 30 minutes or so for questions, and if my reading of this group and the dean's reading of this group is right, I have a feeling that a lot of questions that you'd like to get out. Who would like to start off? Yes.
So, practical recommendations. How do we use the taxpayers' money to improve parenting in the country?
Okay, well, let me answer that by avoiding the question entirely at first. Seems to me there's 2 things you can tell the taxpayers. One, you can promise them to do good by reducing the crime rate. The second is you can promise them to stop taking their money and spending it in ways that has nothing to do with the crime rate. I think one of the very fundamental things we ought to tell the taxpayers right now is the latter. We should say, this has been a big lie. It's a noble lie. We believe it. But the fact of the matter is, incarceration does not affect the crime rate. Now, affecting the crime rate is clearly only one of the reasons you use incarceration. Some people deserve to go to prison. Right? But apart from that, the length of the term, the folks we're sending to prison, combinations, imprisonment will not lower the crime rate. So, and I think that implicitly we have been telling the public that it will. I think that when legislators argue for mandatory minimum terms, oftentimes, when they argue for increased incarceration of all sorts, I think they are given a promise to the taxpayers. And it's a promise they haven't delivered on, and it's a promise they cannot deliver on. So I would say, as Leslie Wilkins used to tell us in the old days, if you can't save souls, at least you can save money. So saving on money is good public policy. Okay? There's nothing wrong with not spending public money in ways that's not effective. And I want to that is a positive policy recommendation, right, of this theory. What do you do about child rearing? Big issue. Different kettle of fish. I can't tell you with any confidence. I've got this model that I think is right. It derives from the literature. This, monitoring, those 4 steps that I think squares with the known facts. I think you can teach people to be better parents. I think that doing that, however, and I think that we can have different parenting forms than we have now. Having said that, I realize that runs head-on into a lot of issues about the government raising people's children and so forth. And that's delicate territory. I say what you have to do is balance things. I'm actually reasonably prepared to do it, because I think, in some ways, because I think that the consequences for low self-control for children are so negative, are so profoundly adverse to their own interests, that it would be good to teach kids self-control who don't have it. It would be in their own good. Now, and I also recognize that there's been plenty of people around the world who've done things to people in their own good that turned out not to be such a good idea. But if you think about the consequences to the children, and I say all children come into the world prepared to do the same thing: steal, lie, cheat, get what they want. And what happens is they're differentially socialized not to do that. Okay? I think we all come into the world with the same predilections, and that we all get the same break in having those things stamped out of us. And we tend not to all get the same break in having them stamped out of us. So I think some programs about hardcore parenting and socialization practices for high-risk youth are appropriate. You have to look at them one at a time to see whether it stepped over some bounds of intervention you'd be not prepared to follow. But that's where I put my money. I don't think that anything else is likely to be effective long term. And I would look, incidentally, I would look for evidence of this not only in the early, in terms of the stability effect and the early onset, but I think you can look cross-culturally. I think that one of the big differences between us and countries that have lower crime rates than we do has to do with childhood socialization practices. I go a lot further, by the way, and I'm in a management school. And so I'm surrounded by these people all the time who are saying, God, we have to run over to Japan, find out how they manage people, and bring it back over here and manage them because they're passing us up, in all measures of productivity. Their GNP is proportionate to debt, smaller than ours is, and we're getting second rate. The Japanese, and I tell them, no, what you really ought to do is you ought to go over and look at how they raise their children. And that's one of the big differences where the big difference is. Self-control is a very general trait that affects people in all sorts of circumstances, all walks of life. I apologize for not having a specific intervention model, in mind, having, thrown everything else away. But I don't any further than that.
Yes.
Earlier you mentioned that teaching self-control is something like teaching morals. With your very general definition of crime, since it covers more than crime, exactly whose morals are you going to teach? How do you decide what morals to teach? Since across our society there are so many different sets of morals.
I dispute your premise. I don't think there are a variety of different moral sets across society in terms of the activities that we're talking about. In my view, and empirically driven, I believe, all groups dislike homicide, forcible rape, robbery, assault. I go further, all groups dislike driving their cars into walls and killing themselves and so forth. So that the utilitarian model, this rational choice model, which is by no means, I mean, we did not create anything here. No, we are putting different words on a very old tradition, is all. Does see a correspondence between crime and morals. It tends to believe that things that are criminal tend to be immoral. Right? So there's a very close correspondence. And I think you just need to look around the world's religions and moral traditions to support that point of view. The reason this kind of utilitarian theory says that those things are immoral and criminal is because unless we agree to that, we cannot have social groups. Right? I mean, it's these social contract utilitarian theories, like this is, go right back to the nature of man as pursuing self-interest whenever he can get away with it, and that unless you constrain him, it's a war of all against all. Morality is efforts to constrain self-interest. That's the way I'm using the term. So our limits on the relentless pursuit of self-interest over above the interests of other people, when we try to constrain that, we're trying to act morally, we're trying to act in a way that's supportive of the criminal law, too. So I see a very heavy correspondence between the two.
Mr. Weaver.
Yes. Would it be in concert with your theory to target money well spent toward young adult prisoners in education? Probably a period in their lives that it's the only discipline they've ever known. Do you think that would be money well spent, or is it? Do you think it would be too late?
I think it's too late. I think that I mean, you would get some isolation effect if you have the right group, the high-rate group. But I would, I mean, I'm not opposed to giving people job skills and so forth. I think for social welfare purposes, I think that's a fine idea. I don't think it's going to reduce crime. I think that to reduce crime, you have to start 15 years in advance. And I mean, that really is the rub with respect to crime policy. Because you have to stand up on the floor of the legislature and say, I promise to reduce crime in the year 2006 by this program. That's when we're going to see the first effect. Did I do the math right? I don't know. Right? I mean, you know, the policy effects will be reaped when the kids turn in the high crime age, 15, 17 years old. But the flip side of that is, that's the only way to do it.
A follow-up question, if I may.
Yeah.
Critical thinking skills. Some states are experimenting with that, putting it into an educational realm.
Mm-hmm.
For example, combining it with teaching history, mathematics, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Don't think anything would be served in that. Not sermonizing in a particularized moralistic fashion, but just teaching critical thinking skills.
I don't really know what you're referring to in terms of critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
But if whatever it is, it's got to be taught to 8-year-olds.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay.
Right, we have three hands. Mr. Anderson and then the third person here. So that's good.
I read your book on the general theory of crime, and I was trying to figure out whether or not your theory, the self-control theory, serves to explain why powerless people commit crimes. Because I read the chapters on white-collar crime and organized crime, and I think I missed the analysis. It really didn't concentrate on a lot of those people who committed those kind of crimes, perpetrated those acts.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I don't even think you all define what white-collar crime meant or what organized crime is. And I was wondering, does the theory serve to explain crime in its totality, or is it a theory that serves to explain crime committed by powerless people?
It explains all crime, no matter who commits it. Okay. Yep. It goes for the whole 9 yards. Yep. This theory doesn't like terms like white-collar crime, organized crime, burglary. It doesn't like specific characteristics of the activity. Whenever you define And that's a big, erroneous tradition in criminology, in our view. When you start defining crime on the basis of the characteristics of the people who commit it, you have failed to explain crime already. And you have contaminated your dependent and your independent variable. Sutherland started us on that road, and it's too bad because it has caused a lot of problems. Just like we shouldn't talk about church crime. What is church crime? Well, I guess church crime could be crime committed by people who work in churches and steal from the resources of the church. What's the point of defining an activity as church crime? Well, you've certainly restricted the opportunity of people to commit it. You've defined it on the basis of characteristics of people, so you now can't use characteristics of people to explain it. So I can't say, well, the cause of church crime is people in church, right? Because white-collar crime, labor force. So we don't recognize, and this is a very difficult point for us to make. I agree we haven't made it well. But it's a difficult point for us to make. We do not recognize the legitimacy of those distinctions. This theory cannot tolerate a thing like white-collar crime. It says there's crime throughout the occupational structure. It defines crime as acts of force, fraud, or mood enhancement in pursuit of immediate self-interest without regard for long-term consequences. A lot of what you think of as white-collar crime fits into that. A lot of what I think you should think of as white-collar crime fits into that too. So, for example, is embezzlement a white-collar crime? Well, according to one guy's definition of white-collar crime, it is. According to another guy's definition, it's not. I don't have any trouble saying embezzlement's crime. Right? Stealing from your employer is crime. Now, if I look at the characteristics of embezzlement, I say, gee, those are the same character. That looks just like any other kind of crime. All right? What's the typical embezzlement? Well, it's not Ivan Botsky, he's not an embezzler, as far as I know. It's not the bank vice president shaving money and putting it in a firm. Embezzlement is some teenage boy stealing from the till. All right? It's occupational setting kind of crime. Now, the import of that for public policy is, we're going all over the country passing embezzlement statutes. Right? I mean, there's white-collar crime fever, especially in the federal system, where all kinds of white-collar crime behaviors that the sanctions for them are going up and up, and people are saying, that's good, we're finally getting the white-collar offenders and putting them behind bars. You know who we're getting and putting behind bars? We're getting the guy who's taking the money out of the till, because that's what the characteristic crimes are. Big study of white-collar offending in the federal system. Wheeler and his colleagues, they took a look at all of the indictments under the Sherman Antitrust Act. They followed them through the system, said what happened to them. They characterized the typical violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act something like the following. One man owns a laundry in Florida where he does the laundry for the Motel 6s. Another man opens a laundry and they have a cup of coffee, and one guy says to the other, if you don't go to the Motel 6s and try to do theirs, I'll stay away from the Ramada Inns. Right? That's a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. They're prosecuted, and that's the activity that gets, and that's the imprisonment activity. Now, that's as far removed from what people had in mind when they're talking about let's get white-collar offenders and nail them and put them in prison than it could possibly be. The idea was long-planned, highly intricate financial dealings. And I've looked a lot into white-collar crimes. And I'm really hard-pressed to find highly intricate financial dealings. They tend to be overt, frank frauds. They're relatively simple and occur to somebody that they can get away with it. Just like the guy who takes the car. If you're going to sell junk bonds on the floor of your savings and loan, and you got FDLC on the door, as people walk in, and you got one booth that says 12% interest, and then you got a window that says CDs 5.5%, and you don't have a big sign that says this one's insured and this one's not. Well, people are going to walk over and try to get the 12.5%, and that's what they did, and that's fraud, and at least under certain characters. I don't know if the guy's been convicted or not, but well, that's not a master crook. That's not a big swindle. That's an ordinary kind of fraudulent transaction. It didn't require much. And I think insider trading the same way. You look behind them. The laws are complicated. The activities are banal.
Yes.
I'm coming from early childhood, and I agree with you 100% that we got to attack the situation before age 8. However, in Texas, we've seen in the past year our early childhood programs cut in order to finance state mandates for these prisons. What would you recommend that we as taxpayers do to affect our legislatures to get the balance back?
Demand some accountability in the same way we demand accountability in other sectors. And again, I am a criminal justician. I mean, that's my training. I work in the criminal justice system a lot, particularly in the courts. I don't think that most people in the criminal justice system will disagree one whit with what I've had to say. I would say, look, you're putting your money in the wrong basket. The crime rate is going up. It has been going up. People are afraid. And that's true. But you have to face the facts that you can do very little about that immediately. You can do something about that in the long term, maybe, but you can do very little about that immediately. And to incarcerate people, I believe, under a deterrent rationale or even under an incapacitative rationale, cannot be justified on the basis of the data. That the crime rate is unaffected by those. Obviously, I mean, we heard it even this morning from a gentleman. It's very difficult for a legislator, because of the tenor of the times, to stand up on the floor of the legislature and say, there's been a bill that's been introduced to increase terms by 5 years. I say no. I'm not going to do it. And sit down. And the person referred to it as political suicide. Part of the problem is our problem. I think if people, politicians, are somewhat responsive to public opinion, if people decide that these expenditures are not useful, politicians will stop spending money that way.
Mr. Stone?
How do you explain the criminals such as Ivan Boesky?
How do I explain him?
Yes, sir.
Same way.
Your theory of crime.
Ivan saw a temptation that he could not pass up. He thought of the his immediate interests and the untold millions of dollars, and he saw no way that there were long-term consequences. He miscalculated the long-term consequences. He got caught. Now, do I explain it the same way that white-collar crime theorists tend to explain it? A business culture in which you thought anything you can get away with is okay? Nope. I don't think you believe that at all. Interact with business people all the time. I don't think they believe that. They thought it was wrong. He thought it was wrong. He thought he'd get away with it. He didn't.
I think we have to start with David and Glenn and Dean.
My question refers to, we talked about this morning, this afternoon, some of your long-term policy implications. One thing that I haven't heard you mention, I'd like to hear you comment on, is some of the, from your perception, the long-term implication on a revision of a criminal code or on a revision of certain statutes. Recently, I'm sure you've heard in Houston, we had a 3-year-old, I think, who was apprehended in terms of selling narcotics, who obviously had been trained from the mother and the grandmother. I can foresee, in terms of the implementation of your general theory of crime, that the criminal code would switch. So that in that instance, there may be a sanction that's applied against the parent in terms of you would either, I don't know, you would lose the kid, you would have to go through parenting classes 3 times a week for 20 weeks. I can just hear your comment in terms of long-term implications.
Yeah, I could certainly support those kinds of policies. Criminal code revision. Well, I have a lot of preferences about that. Some of which derive from this theory, and some of which don't. You know, I mean, but the ones that derive from the theory, I would stop using imprisonment as a crime reduction technique. I would try the best that I could to stop using the criminal justice system as a crime reduction technique. I would put money in prevention programs. I would have put money in police proactively preventing. I believe in neighborhood watch. I believe in all sorts of denial of opportunity kinds of prevention programs that are excellent activities for police. I wouldn't use prisons for a crime reduction purpose. I would try to have a criminal code that is commensurate with society's retributive beliefs, essentially. What society is willing to tolerate as punishment for a particular offense. And I'd stop trying to persuade people that the criminal justice system was doing anything other than that.
I mean, in terms of,
So that's got a lot of criminal code revision stuff in it.
but I'm more concerned in terms of the application of the principles to restricting certain people's rights. That it gets dicey. And you've talked on,
Yes.
in terms of, is
I see what
it
you're
going to be against the law? We're going to start sanctioning or rewriting the laws to deal with parenting.
Yes.
And that gets
Yes.
pretty
Oh, yeah.
dicey. And I think
Right.
utilitarianism, for a while,
Yes.
slavery seemed to be okay because it met the needs of the masses. And I guess that causes me concerns in terms of long-term implications. What extreme?
You lost me in the connection to slavery, but I guess what I would do is say, look, frankly, we can pretend like we cannot predict the next generation of criminally active people if we want to, as we do now, but that's wrong. We know with reasonable accuracy where the next generation of criminal offenders are going to come from. So I start there. And I say it is, given the substantial detrimental consequences to those children for their lives, it is offensive to ignore that fact. I mean, it's morally indefensible. So we've known for some time, with reasonable degree of accuracy, not perfect accuracy, not enough accuracy to allow punitive interventions, in my view, but we know that crime runs in families. Right? There's a whole body of people who think they know why it runs in families on a genetic basis. I disagree with them, fight with them all the time. But we do know, with reasonable accuracy, we can locate the next generation of delinquents. And separate people into reasonably broad categories. I think that presupposes a moral imperative. Since we can't identify those children, we know that they are bound for negative life circumstances. How can we possibly continue to ignore that fact? And the life consequences are death, incarceration, sexually transmitted diseases, all sorts of bad things. Shouldn't be allowed to happen. So I say that we can target those people and start working preventatively to try to alter that life course. It has to be done early. So, I think kind of the moral suasion argument is decidedly in my favor.
I didn't attend your morning lecture, and my questions or comments are probably more appropriate to what you lectured about this morning. But it occurs to me that Sigmund Freud would smile upon your theory because you both assume a rather negative view of man, and man left to his own pursuits will essentially be narcissistic and hedonistic and self-serving. He would also agree with you, I think, that there is a kind of critical period for socialization, and once that period is passed, the possibilities for effectively changing or monitoring behavior are very limited. Mm-hmm. You say 8 years, Freud would have said 5 years. Mm-hmm. But you seem to assume that once a person at age 8, we can identify those who are likely to be at risk for problematic behavior later on. The assumption seems to be that is necessarily a function of socialization or the failure of socialization to occur, yes. And that is a function of parenting or caregiving, as opposed to any kind of genetic or biological given. Your earlier comment touched on that, but I mean, on what basis do you side on come down on one side as opposed to the other?
Okay, I'm well pleased to be compared to Freud. I don't see him as one of the big evils. He was wrong about a number of things. I think the psychosocial stages is wrong. We don't see any stages activity in the literature. I think the idea that you could actually go back and redo it is far-fetched and so forth. But I think he's a control theorist. Jeremy Bentham's a control theorist. Gary Becker's a control theorist. Lots of control theorists. We share similar assumptions, different theories. Why do I focus on parenting rather than genetics? Because in my reading of the evidence, that's where the action is. In this book, we very carefully dissect the contributions from biological criminologists in documenting or failing to documenting important genetic transmission. We review the important studies, find them defective. They don't persuade me in any way. They are seriously defective methodologically, in my view. And you can read that discussion at your leisure. They disagree, I assure you. And as I mentioned to some people earlier, when I talk at different places around the country about this theory, I am most often put in, not in a criminology setting or criminal justice, in juxtaposition with a behavior geneticist. Is it genetics? Is it early childhood socialization? And that's where the war takes place in most of the world that I operate in these days. I think I know that literature fairly well, and it's unpersuasive to me. But what is very persuasive to me is the continuous, large, impressive correlations between children, attitudes that children have about their parents and vice versa in terms of criminality. Some of the oldest and largest and most persistent correlations have to do with the affection that parents have to their children, the perception of the children's affection, and its reciprocity in terms of separating people into delinquents and non-delinquents. I think that easily goes back to the Gluck's work. Certainly includes all the self-report literature that I'm familiar with, including the causes of delinquency kind of work, Weston, Farrington, and so forth. So there is an indisputable, in my view, not methodologically linked, major relationship between parental activities and affection towards their children and children's perception of that and subsequent delinquency. So whereas I see very little evidence of a relationship, I'm not going to dispute that for all time it's implausible, and control theories are agnostic about, as in where this variation comes from. It just says it comes. Our version of control theory says the family. Others, David Rose, most prominently now in criminology, says it's heritable. I wish he had better evidence.
Yeah, there's a curious confluence between current events and some of your remarks today. Due to I guess, unprecedented upsurge in violent crime in Houston, a lot of people are making lots of statements about what needs to be done in terms of crime. The one that intrigued me most recently over the weekend was a county court judge that was advocating, again, not a new idea, but castration of male offenders, sterilization of female offenders, not so much for preventive purposes, but as punishment for crime. And I guess the question that I raise is, to what extent, as a social scientist, are you nervous about the policy implications that people are willing to read into your theory? And going back to Phil's question, to what extent are you concerned that people read an argument for parental fitness testing, for example, and perhaps preemptive sterilization of certain subgroups of society, because, as you say, we know where the next group of criminals is coming from with some precision? Does that worry you?
Well, I long ago stopped worrying about those things. The only way you can not worry about that people are going to misinterpret you or misconstrue you is not to write anything. And I make a living writing things, and so I decided I'd rather earn money than worry about that. You just can't at one level. The theory is pretty explicit about those kinds of concerns. I mean, we argue, if you think about the fundamental assumption, is, I would just say it again, we are all born into this world exactly the same when it comes to our criminal inclinations. And it's not that we're born antisocial, which many people accuse control theorists of. It's that we are born amoral. I mean, we're not antisocial. We are born without a consideration of others, and a consideration of others is stamped into us one way or another, or it's not. So. I couldn't see a possible justification for those kinds of policies, given that we're all alike. What would be the point? But I'm misconstrued enough by the professional literature to know that, in fact, if I could have the world my way, I would take misconstruction by politicians any day if my colleagues would just tell it like it is.
That's a low line.
Kind of following up on Glenn's question, perhaps from a different end of the continuum. Some could argue that your theoretical perspective is not unlike that Bonger advocated from an economic perspective, though, that would suggest that there are conditions in the economic institutional structure that perhaps are more conducive to a lack of self-control. He called egoism. Mm-hmm. And why do you go to the family institution and not to the economic or political institution as the primary causal factor for this poor socialization?
Under the theory of proximate causality, I mean, a simplistic theory, which is one we strive for, wants to get as close to the action as possible. And so we think is the most proximate cause is the family effects. If you can, you can take this kind of theory and step back 2 steps and argue where the variability in family socialization practices come from if you want. There's an infinite regress, obviously, that you can engage in. So simply under the principle of trying to identify proximate causes in a simplified theory. We talked a lot about that, and also the book's too long.
I'd like to have a follow-up question on this. Can you be then accused of treating the symptoms yet again rather than the causes, whatever the causes may be? If you say the family is just the proximate cause, I would say it's just a symptom.
Yeah, sure. On the other hand, you can make the same argument about cigarette smoking and cancer, right? I mean, there's reasonable reason to believe that people who smoke cigarettes at a higher rate than others are more likely to develop certain forms of lung cancer. Does cigarette smoking cause lung cancer? Well, not if you're a biogeneticist, it doesn't. There's something in the cigarette smoking or in a property of the smoke or a property of the additives to the smoke that causes lung cancer. So you can develop a theory at whatever level of abstraction you want, but that's not to deny that there are important policy implications, reasonable ones, that can be effective by arguing, however misguided it is, that cigarette smoking causes cancer. So if you stop smoking cigarettes or have some prevention effort to stop smoking cigarettes, the incidence of cancer will go away, and you may never know why cigarettes cause cancer. So there's not an ineluctable relationship between causal properties and public policy, but they can inform one another. So I would say whatever the source of family disruption and difficulties, make it go away, make kids socialized, crime will be reduced.
Any other questions? Or, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before we adjourn, a couple